Okay, great. So first of all, I'll just say thanks, Dominik, for covering this session. It was sort of a last-minute thing because the previous speaker had to postpone. So yeah, thanks very much for taking the time to cover this. I'll pass straight over to you for the session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Luke. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here with you guys on the third session of our brain modeling workshop, even though we meant to organize it in a little bit different way at the beginning, but I believe that right now, like, everyone got settled in a new situation, and there's been already quite a few virtual events, so we have some experience with it. And I would like to also thank my collaborators, Luke, Marino, and Alex. I believe that today we have Luke and they will try to monitor the chat and answer all of your questions. Speaking of which, before we get to the gist of my talk, I wanted to pass you a couple of housekeeping announcements. So slides for this talk and all the practical exercises in MATLAB are available on this GitHub repository. So feel free to go there now if you want to follow along. If you have some questions later, or if you're rewatching this video later, the best place to ask questions is this little forum. And throughout the course of this talk, I will be making some breaks, and that's probably the best time to answer all your questions, either on chat or simply unmute yourself, and then we can have a little conversation. So the battle plan for today is to start over from a little recap of what we've covered so far during this workshop. So I believe that the first session was in the middle of May or something, so it's been a while. So I think it's worth to make a little recap on stability analysis, as this part will be crucial in the second part of my talk, which is about bifurcations. The part 2 and 3 will be actually combined together, where I'll try to give you examples of what types of bifurcations we have, and some the practical examples from how we can use them in neuroscience. And then I will conclude with a little intro on our hands-on session. Okay, so without any further ado, let's go to in parts of the talk. As I was saying, stability analysis is something that you covered already with Luke, but this is pretty important topic that will be very useful to remind ourselves what is that. But to be sure that we are all on the same page, let me remind you that we are dealing with dynamical systems, which are sort of systems usually described by some equation, but this is in general some sort of a system that evolves in time according to predefined set of rules. And formally, we usually put it as the first derivative of something that we call a state variable. So state variable is usually that variable that we are interested in observing and that relates somehow to our experiment. And very often that variable is modulated by some mathematical functions. Also, it depends on some set of parameters that affect the behavior of such a dynamical system. So before, on the first and second session, we focused mainly on analysis of the behavior of those state variables, and this is something that I would like to remind you right now. Just to conclude, maybe what I mentioned, like in the previous session with Luke, I believe you learned that this dynamical system is described by something that is formally called ordinary differential equation, but this is just, you know, some sort of like a smart expression to say that it evolves in time in that particular way. And usually, like generally speaking, those systems, they follow like a two asymptotic like behaviors. Either they like explode to infinity in different pace, sometimes slower, sometimes faster, or they like gravitate slowly to something that we call either steady state or fixed point. I will be using those like terms interchangeably here, but those can be also stable or unstable. And also I will remind you what that means in details in a second. So for example, this plot also should look like familiar for you. So here we have the first derivative of our state variable versus that state variable, and when this curve that actually describes this like a function, describes this evolution in time, hits this like point 0, those like points we usually identify or describe as those like a fixed points. And then I mentioned you before that we have like two types, the stable ones or unstable ones. And the algorithm that sort of Luke explained you in the first session in May went pretty much like this, that if this part of the curve is above 0, then that means that increases, so it like moves towards the right. Whereas if that part of the curve, for example, is like below 0, then it means that our state variable, so x here, decreases. So it goes towards left in that particular case. When the arrows actually point towards the same direction, then we call such a point stable. Whereas when they point like outwards, we describe such a point as unstable. And in general, actually, this shape of that curve can be pretty complex. So it's not always like that easy to say like straight away with what type of point we are dealing with. So very often, mathematically, what we do is we zoom in sort of in the area very close to our fixed point. And what we do is mathematical procedure called Taylor series expansion to the first order, but we can simply call it linearization. And what that means is that we approximate some part of the function by a straight line. And why we do it why we approximate it by straight line exactly? Well, I hope it's going to be clear in that slide. As for the straight line, it's very easy to tell straight away which part of that curve is above 0 and which part is like below 0. And similarly for the unstable case, right? And more formally, what we do is we compute something which is called like gradient, which exactly describes what is happening with our function in the like proximity of our fixed point. The other way to look at it is that we sort of make a little nudge or like we poke our system in the fixed point that we are interested in like analyzing, and then we observe what is happening with that fixed point. When we like nudge it a little and it comes back to its like original location, then actually that would be a consequence of a negative gradient in that point. When the gradient is actually positive, then that would mean that after our like a gentle poke, then that system would be completely distracted from its stability. So I hope that this little visual will help you remember that simple rule that when the gradient of our function in the fixed point we are interested in is like less than 0, that would mean that our like nudge was like very gentle and small, and system remains stable. Whereas when after our like nudge the system, as you can see, falls down, then we call such a fixed point unstable. Okay, and here I designed a little exercise for you to sort of like a practice this stability of the fixed points, as this is like very important notion. So I will ask you to maybe write on chat what type of fixed point we have in A, B, or C. Is it stable or unstable? If I could ask you to write that down in a chat right now. I hope that with like everything I said, it's not going to be that difficult, but I will give you like few more minutes. But if you are still unsure, we'll try to revise it together. Okay, I can see some first responses. And when we go to the answers, we can see like this very like similar like plot to what we plot like before with those like little arrows, right? So that part of the curve is like above 0, so it then our arrow like points towards the right, and then like following the same algorithm here, it's like less than 0, it points towards left, so they both point towards like the same direction, so this stable point we can call stable. Whereas here for B, this part of the curve is below 0, so it points towards left. Here it points towards right, so they both like point outward. Thus B is unstable, whereas like C is like pretty like analogous to A actually. But as you can see, this is just to like demonstrate you that like those like functions can be a little bit like more complicated. If you are still like unsure about that procedure, I advise you to simply revise the session first of this tutorial. You have the all the recordings. I believe that Luke sent that to you some time ago. Okay, but that was this very simple case for one-dimensional systems when we were dealing only with one state variable, whereas like in general, the situation gets a little bit like more complicated, as usually our dynamical systems are described by more than one variable. Very often we try to reduce it only to 2 variables, which already simplifies a problem quite a bit. Usually it's even more. Thus, this stability analysis is not as simple as that previous procedure would suggest. But even here, we can make a couple of simplifying assumptions, and by analogy to the procedure that we covered before, we can find some similarities. So this time, instead of computing this gradient of our like function in like particular fixed point we are interested in, what we compute instead is something that we call Jacobian, which a matrix, as now we have like more than one variable. And for this particular Jacobian, there is like a very simple procedure that is called computing eigenvalues or eigenvectors decomposition. And it basically takes one MATLAB call to compute it. And what those eigenvectors and eigenvalues actually show. Eigenvectors show me like the direction of the lines that determine the stability of my dynamic system landscape, whereas eigenvalues instead show me sort of like the pace or the pace of this gradient that goes like along those like eigenvectors. And now from that we can read that if all of my eigenvalues are below, then we can call such a system stable. When all of my eigenvalues are above 0, we call it unstable. In other cases, it is non-conclusive, so we need to simply perform some additional numerical tests. And then again, we can come back to this little like a visual that hopefully facilitates your helps you like understand what those conditions actually denote. So actually for lambdas or eigenvalues less than 0, we are dealing with this like a stable state, whereas for lambdas higher than 0, we have unstable state. And again, like the procedure is exactly the same. For given fixed point, we do this little sort of like a nudge of our dynamical variable, and then we test how it changes in time. Okay, so I believe that this like pretty much summarizes the stability analysis, but there's not only that. As apart from telling whether the point is stable or unstable, we can also in multidimensional systems discriminate a lot of different types of our fixed points. So, for example, for stable points, we can distinguish so-called sinks. For unstable points, we have sources, centers. There is also saddles. So everything that is covered on this so-called Poincaré diagram. I forgot French, people are probably butchering this name. If you want to learn more about that, very good resource is actually Wikipedia's article on like stability theory that pretty much like summarizes how you can determine with what type of stable or with what type of like fixed point you are dealing with, depending on the parameters of your stable system. So this will be not a subject of this talk, but it is possible to sort of answer the question what type of stable point we have in our system. Okay. But the main part, but today's talk is about bifurcations rather than about stability. So let's first try to answer what bifurcation actually is. So bifurcation occurs when a very small smooth change is made to the parameters of our dynamical system, and it causes a sudden qualitative change of its behavior. So for example, it may change the stability of the system, right? So before we had either stable or unstable points, then we had also like different types of those points. So bifurcation can either change the type of the stable point or exactly can, or actually can change the stability of it. So whereas like before, we were mainly focusing on this dynamical variable part when we were like analyzing our dynamical system, Today, we will focus more on actually manipulating and changing the parameters of this system. So we will focus on this R part. And to help you again to visualize better what bifurcation is, rather than this like a formal definition, you can think of it as our dynamical system being in some like a stable point, which we can refer to, coming back to the recent historical events of like Britain being in European Union, and then there is like a small change of the parameters of the situation among the voters. And sometimes if we like carry on with this like a change of this like parameter, that can lead to the total chaos. Coming back to the more neuroscientific example, you can also remember the previous talk by Marino when he was talking about epilepsy. So here you can imagine a situation when we have a brain being in a resting, idle state, and with some change of some parameter that we don't know, actually brain goes towards this like epileptic state. So I believe that finding this like parameter that is responsible of that transition is sort of like a holy grail of whole epilepsy research. Okay, and now we will take a couple of like specific examples to understand better what bifurcation is and how it helps neuroscientists to solve different problems. But let's start from, I would say, like a abstract example. We take a very simple mathematical function, which is r, some parameter r plus x squared, right? And now we can plot that function in like a three situations. So by the way, those like plots are no different from those like plots that you have seen like many times that were describing the first derivative of the state variable on y-axis and the state variable on x-axis. So this is all the same. And now we have like three different situations. For negative r, as you know already from the stability analysis, we can see two fixed points, out of which one is stable, the other is unstable. R equals 0 is something that we call the critical point, because this is the point when actually something interesting starts happening, right? So here, when we approach this point from the left side, we can see that it might be stable, but when we approach it from the right side, it is repulsing, right? Whereas for r greater than 0, this curve does not intersect with like 0. Thus, we conclude that there is no fixed points whatsoever here. So our system is we don't really have any fixed points. So now out of this we can so here I cherry picked for you like a three representative like situations for different values of r, right? But what we can do is to analyze this like situation continuously, in a sense. So that creates for us something that people call a bifurcation plot. So basically, for different values of r, we basically what we do, we try to like determine what type of points, stable or unstable, we have, and then how many of such a fixed points we have. So this plot tells you exactly that, right? So here is our critical point, r equal 0. And if we have r greater than that, then we don't have any steady states like whatsoever. Whereas for R smaller than 0, we have 2 points, one of which is stable, the other one is unstable. So here on this like graph, I put the arrows that you should already be familiar with from this like stability analysis that point like outwards from like this point and towards the stable point, right? Okay, and so that was sort of like an abstract example, you would think, but however, what appears is that even with such a very simplistic model, we can tell something about, we can refer that model to neurophysiology. Apparently, scientists realize that this model fairly well approximates something that we call leaky, integrate, and fire model. So they started using it as sort of like a quadratic neuron model in the following way. So now we replace our state variable x by v that denotes the voltage potential of our measured on the membrane of our neuron. And now our parameter r represents the current that we apply to this neuron. So for the situation when I is like fairly low or like lower than 0, we come back to like this situation that you know from the previous plot, when we have like a 2 fixed points, one of which is like stable, so the system like converges to like this particular point. Then for some like critical value of I, something interesting happens. So now this system sort of like loses its stability, and in like a normal way we would have this like asymptotic behavior where it would go to infinity in a sense. But what people do instead is they introduce this reset mechanism. So like every time the value of x reaches some like level, it is resetted back to some like initial value. And thanks to that mechanism, actually we can trigger something like oscillations. And here I believe we have data that was like actually recorded in the lab. And here is the simulated behavior of exactly this very like simple system. And as you can see, these two plots are like not that different. So I believe that this simple example like proved you that even with like very simple set of equations, we can learn something about behavior of individual neuron. So one important thing to mention here is that this very simple model describes something which we call as type 1 neurons. And what this type 1 neuron is, we'll learn in 2 minutes. Okay, another interesting thing about this bifurcation is that you might remember that we already came across a similar bifurcation, and it was on our last session when Marino introduced us to the Theta model. Just as a reminder, this Theta described the phase of the oscillations of our like neuronal system. And at the beginning, we had the situation that was like pretty similar to the one that you can remember from this like quadratic neuron. We had like 2 fixed points. One was unstable, the other was like stable. So like the system was like converging to this one particular state. Then after we like crossed some like critical value, so some like higher like current was like flowing into this like node described of that system, then the 2 points were like merged together, and as a consequence they vanished entirely. And that was like a trigger to produce the behavior that was like interpreted later on in the case of that system as epileptic behavior. Another thing worth to mention here is that this particular type of bifurcation is called saddle node bifurcation, and the names basically comes from this like Poincaré diagram that describe what type of points we can have, and the basically this like a merger here describes that exactly at this critical point we have something which is called like we have a point that is called a saddle. Okay, so all those like previous like models were undergoing actually saddle node bifurcations, and I want you to take from here that like this type of bifurcation is like useful in neuroscience, but there's also another like type that is quite ubiquitous in neuroscientific literature. And that bifurcation is so-called Andronov-Hopf bifurcation, but very often like just shortened to the Hopf bifurcation. And in that type of bifurcation, what is like very characteristic in its like landscape is those like a spirals or orbits, and they are usually controlled by some parameter. Let's call this parameter beta here. And for beta smaller than 0, as you can see, we observe like this behavior when the system like converges like slowly along this like spiral to this like steady state. For critical value of beta, instead of this like a 1 point, we have some orbit, but still this orbit is like stable. So whichever like initial point we put on this plot, we will always like gravitate like slowly towards this orbit. But for beta greater than 0, apart from this like a spiral convergence behavior, some unstable point emerge like in the middle, and this we called actually like a source, right? So this is sort of like a source of the like information, and it all like goes like towards this orbit. And again, that might surprise you that we already came across on such a bifurcation before, and that was during session 1 when you were analyzing Wilson-Cowan model that was describing this neuronal like population that consisted of excitatory and inhibitory like neurons communicating with each other. There was also some external current applied to this system, to the excitatory part. This time it was referred to as like a P variable, and I believe that that was the part of your like exercises to play with this parameter P, and once you like increased the value of P to some like particular value, the system started oscillating. Then with the increase of P, you could observe increased frequency, but also amplitude of these oscillations until you crossed another characteristic point, and all those oscillations calmed down. Okay, so that pretty much like summarizes like a two bifurcations that are very important in neuroscience and that produce oscillations. And why you could actually ask me why those particular types of bifurcations are important. And it's just because of the information that is on this slide. And maybe let's start to read it from the bottom. So people identified like experimentally that in brain there is in general like two types of neurons. The first type actually is characterized by this like firing by this tuning curve that you can see on this plot at the bottom on the left. And on the x-axis, we have the current applied to this neuron. On the y-axis, we have the firing rate. So how many spikes this neuron sends per second. And as you can see, if we cross this like characteristic current, this type of neuron can generate the firing rate that is infinitesimally small. So basically, it can start like firing with like a very small frequency. Whereas for the other type of neuron, type 2, that was also found in the brain, we have completely different behavior. So when we cross this like characteristic point, then neuron starts firing already with like pretty fast firing rate. So you can imagine a situation that neuron immediately after applying some current starts sending like 10 spikes per second. So this like a first type of like bifurcation. I already mentioned that it emerged in this like Theta model, whereas this other type of bifurcation, the Wilson-Cowan model was displaying it. So like these two types are also like used for different applications, not only to describe like the individual like neurons, but they also may help with like other like neuroscientific interpretations of the system, like modeling epilepsy or generating like gamma oscillations. Another important thing is how the amplitude of this state variables behaves. So in the saddle node case, usually the oscillations emerge with the fixed amplitude, whereas in Andronov-Hopf bifurcations, even though they start firing rate with some like arbitrary frequency, they might emerge with like pretty low amplitude. And if the previous like table was not clear enough, I really hope that this little animation will help you to understand it. So in terms of like the saddle node bifurcation, as you can see, when we like exceed some threshold like this, like firing rate is at the beginning like very low, but then as long as we like increase the current, the frequency becomes even higher. Whereas for Andronov-Hopf, immediately this like neuron starts like firing with like pretty fast oscillations. And also on the right hand side, you can see that this amplitude like stretches almost to the like 40 nanoamperes, whereas millivolts, whereas like here it's like on the left hand side is like fairly stable. Okay. But so far, we covered mainly the dynamical system that describes the behavior of like individual neuron or like neuronal populations. But you can use also dynamical equations and bifurcations to analyze the cognitive states. So here I show you also three different sets of behavior of the system depending on some parameter R for system that is a little bit more complicated than the for different parameters of R. We are dealing with like three different scenarios. And as you can see here, for positive values of R, this initially stable point, it sort of like a splits into two stable points with this unstable point in the middle. When we come back to this bifurcation plot that I showed you before, this is how it looks depending on like parameter R. And again, please, if you still feel not comfortable with this type of plot, just simply compare it with how it looked in individual cases for arbitrary values of R. But here we have this like a stable case for a negative R. And then we have this like critical value and positive R that is exactly like represented here. So here we have and positive R when those like 3 fixed points show up. So you could interpret such a system as the following situation, that we have the brain that is in its like idle state at the beginning, and then we expose this brain of let's say our participant to some visual stimuli, and then a participant can undertake like one of the actions, right? So he or she can either like press a button, which would be associated with cognitive state 1 when the decision was made, or not press the button, which is again another like a fairly stable behavior represented by some other cognitive state. And yet that pretty much like summarizes sort of like the way you should think about different bifurcations. I hope that it was not like too convoluted. Obviously, those like 3 bifurcations that I covered in that part are not like fully representative to like all the types of bifurcations you can see when you work with dynamical systems. For the whole coverage, I refer you to this Scholarpedia article. For those of you who don't know, Scholarpedia is something like Wikipedia, but articles are written or edited by experts in their fields. So this article is like quite comprehensive and hopefully will help you to understand even better and learn more about other different types of bifurcations. Okay, so before I move on, maybe I will take some questions at this point. So I will have a look at the chat if there's like any pressing issues here. Alternatively, if you have some questions at this point, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask it now. Okay, if there's no like pressing issues with that, let me carry on for the interest of time. So now let's sort of like take advantage of all this knowledge and apply it to some like practical example from like neuroscience. And this example lies pretty close to my heart, as this is the decision-making model. So something that I'm working on at Zhang Zhang's lab at the moment. So for those of you who are not that familiar with random dot motion discrimination task, maybe let me play that little video for you in which we have a rat or a mouse, and the task of the animal is to watch the screen, and on the screen at some point of time a number of dots starts like moving coherently in one direction, either right or left. And the task of the animal is to pick the right side, basically. So this is like pretty standard task used in like neuroscience psychology for many decades, actually. And it's been recorded not only from like rodents, but like similar experiments were made on like monkeys, humans, and usually we are like both animals and humans are like pretty good at solving this task. So just, you know, like a 5% of the coherence of the dots is like enough to get like pretty good accuracy at it. And usually the behavior of like both animals and humans was explained by the very successful model in neuroscience, so-called the drift diffusion model. But this model describes very well the statistics of the behavior of the participant, as well as reaction times, but it doesn't really tell much about the underlying neuronal process that is happening in the brain. So to address that, around 2006, this model that is known today as Wong-Wang model of decision making was introduced. And this simple model actually consists of like two neuronal pools. Each describes the ratio of excitatory to inhibitory connections. As you can see here, you have some recurrent connections to each other that are excitatory. So basically, when some like external stimuli towards like option 1 or towards like option 2 is like provided to this neuronal pool, those neurons starts to accumulate that information, whereas at the same time they send some like inhibitory connections to its competitor. So they basically compete to sort of like a win this battle towards either option 1 or option B. When this like a current that represents the evidence towards option 1 is like higher, then this connection will be like stronger. There will be like way more like inhibitory current flowing towards the competitor, so it is like more likely that this option would win. And this model is described by such a set of differential equations, but what is important here is probably like this bit that basically like shows you that this function is like fairly non-linear. That's why we need to come back to this linearization process that I mentioned you before to sort of compute the types or to determine the stability of the fixed points we are dealing with. So this is that part when I mentioned you that there's like a curve that we plot is not always like very straightforward to analyze. Okay, so once we have like this system like described by like this two equations, we can analyze its behavior with respect to some like external parameters. So usually for those like neuronal mass models we considered so far, we were manipulating with the current applied to the either individual neuron or neuronal pool. Here instead what we are manipulating with is the like coherence of those like dots on the screen. So basically the difficulty of this task. The lower the coherence is, the more difficult this task is because all the dots are moving randomly on the screen. For coherence 100%, all the dots at once are moving towards one of the options. And so here you can see actually so-called phase plane like portraits. I believe that similar plots you have seen before, and we can see it for like a different values of coherence. On this top left panel, we can see a situation where the stimulus is actually like switched off. So in that case, we can identify actually 3 stable points, 2 of which like represent the potential like option to choose, but actually from this like initial point where like in which like neurons operate here, it is way closer to like this stable point here, and to like reach it even faster is like facilitated by the proximity of those like 2 unstable points that actually like repulse this system like from each other, such that it always like converges to this point, and it basically represents the resting state behavior. When we switch on stimulus, but still the coherence of the dots would be like 0, then like those like 2 unstable points merge together with this stable point and they create so-called saddle. So this is exactly this saddle that you can see exactly here. And as you can see, this saddle is characterized by the following behavior, that when our dynamical like variable sort of like is exactly at this sort of like a diagonal direction, then it is attracted towards this unstable point. But when it comes back even closer it is suddenly repulsed towards one of the options. And as you can see, this plot is exactly symmetric, because for the zero coherence, neither of the options is correct, right? So there is like exactly the same probability of choosing like a left side, right side. And on this slide, instead, we can see pretty much like similar behavior, but this time we increase C even more, right? So when C is this, so when our coherence is this time around 6%, this plot becomes even like a less symmetric. So as you can see, there is like a slight preference of choosing the correct option, which is denoted as S1 here. So when the coherence of the dots is around like 50%, I already mentioned you that becomes like very easy. So actually, as you can see from here, almost like I would say 70% of that landscape is covered by the area that converges to this like a right option. Whereas for the coherence of like 100%, this other unstable point vanishes, because there is only like a one option to choose. We have like an absolute certainty that the left side was the right one.
Sorry, Dominik.
Yes?
Could you just go back to the previous slide, please?
Yes.
We haven't actually talked about phase planes before, so could you just briefly go over what the green and orange lines are here, please?
Yes. So the sorry for that. I was sure that it was covered before. So basically the orange line and the green line is something that we call the null lines. So I would say that this is analogous to those like curves that you saw on those one-dimensional plots that and that you use to determine whether like the derivative is above zero or below zero, right? And thanks to that, you were able to draw those like little arrows that were pointing either towards left or towards right, right? So those are like really analogous like curves, exactly the same curves. And basically you can imagine that here on those like plots, you can, so those arrows that you can see represent exactly that. So they represent the direction in which your like dynamical like variable like it travels in this like 2D space. So yeah, I hope that that this is enough. If you need like any more information about what nuclei are and what phase portraits actually are, I think that it will become also clearer in the exercises. Okay, maybe for the interest of time, I will just briefly mention upon this slide, as we have like a whole section during our practical exercises about this behavior. It's just worth to mention that Wong-Wang model does not only provide you with a nice model of binary decision making, but it can also explain some of the some like other like paradigms associated with decision making problem. As for example, one of those can be working memory process, in which the animal or human needs to choose between left or right option after some time from the moment the stimuli vanished from the screen, right? So you can imagine again this scenario when we had like a dots traveling towards right or left, but then at some moment the experiment is like switched off, and then after 1 or like 2 seconds later we need to make our choice. So this is again this bifurcation plot. That's why I wanted you to learn how to read those type of plots. So you should be already familiar with this like a common sort of like a type of notation where the solid line denotes the stable points, dashed lines denote unstable points, and here you have our experimental situation when we start with some stimuli that is switched on, and let's say that we are leaning towards choosing the right option, but we are still not asked to choose, then the stimuli is like switched off, and after some time, actually, even though our certainty like decreases in a sense because we don't see the stimulus anymore, so the firing of those neurons becomes like lower, we are still leaning towards the option that we memorized before. And as I'm saying, like this like paradigm would be included in our exercises too. Okay, so I think that at this point you could like ask me about this like a little like discrepancy that like emerged like right now, because at the beginning I told you all those like very low level models that describe the behavior of like individual neuron of some like a group of groups of neurons together. This Wong-Wang model in the form that I introduced you before, it was maybe a little bit more like an abstract model relating to those like decisions. Okay, I mentioned something about like neuronal pools like communicating with each other, but some of you that have some like a background in experimental biology could notice, for example, that it might be not really realistic as this neuronal pool sends both like excitatory and like inhibitory projections that is not really like biologically plausible. So is there actually some like a neuronal like a through like underlying this model? And apparently there is. So even if you'd like to start over from this like very standard of how like individual neuron behaves, so we all know that probably like the best existing model is a very detailed Hodgkin-Huxley model. We could start over from this point, but you must know that this type of model like Hodgkin-Huxley, even with like contemporary computational like resources, is like quite difficult to simulate on the computers. So especially that for the systems like this like decision system that I mentioned you before, you usually require around like 10,000, 7,000 like neurons working together. So what people do instead, they simplify this model like describing individual neurons by something that we call leaky integrate and fire neuron. And this, one of the examples of this leaky integrate and fire neuron, you could see in a form of this quadratic neuron that I have shown you before. And out of those neurons, you can actually put together a neural network consisting of a number of like spiking neurons. So the neurons that actually send some like spikes, and you can like connect them in biologically like meaningful way. And that model already like explains the experimental data fairly well, but it is quite difficult to interpret simply. So as you can see before, I could easily like draw my phase plane in like 2D like representation and analyze it in details. This model consisting of like 7,200 equations basically would be pretty difficult to analyze. That's why we make some simplifying assumptions, and we can reduce it to this like two variable model. So that's what we did before. But do we actually lose anything about like the power of that model? So let's see. Here is the actual data from the lateral intraparietal area of the monkey's brain cortex during performing this motion discrimination, random dot motion discrimination task. And as you can see, for the like preferred options, there's a lot of like neurons spiking together, right? Whereas for this other option, not preferred, the neurons are rather like silent. So this is representative of that on that plot that simply like averages out all the like spiking activity of the neurons. So here, this like asymptotic behavior that goes almost to that goes up it is for this like preferred option, so the option that monkey chooses as it crosses some like threshold, and the other comes from the second neuronal population that is silented out. And here you have experimental data that represents so-called psychometric curve that depicts the accuracy of choosing by monkey or human depending on the coherence level, right? So as I mentioned you, the higher the coherence level is, the easier the task becomes. And as you can see, usually we like it aligns in the form of this like a sigmoid function. Here we have like reaction times. And now the most important bit I want you to understand from this slide is that when we model this particular task using this like big network with spikes, we get pretty much similar curve to the one that came from the experimental data. The same goes for reaction times. But now when we reduce our model even further to these 2 dimensions, again, we can get like a similar shape in terms of accuracy and also similar qualitative behavior in terms of reaction times. Okay, so I hope that this like convinced you that this model like is like fairly biologically plausible, but also has a lot of like explanatory power in terms of behavior. Okay, so now we can also reduce this Wong-Wang model even further, such that it helps us to analyze processes like different than decision making. So in this study from 2013, Gustavo Deco's group replaced the Wong-Wang model that instead of having like a 2 neuronal population with each other, we have like a 1 neuronal population that basically describes this ratio of excitatory to like the inhibitory firing. They also put those equations to the node of a graph that basically represented a brain. And this is something that you might already know also from the previous session run by Marino, where like each node represents certain area of the brain. So are there some frontal part, occipital part, and so on and so forth. Whereas the edges of this graph, they represent the structural connectivity, and that can be estimated experimentally using, for example, DTI. So important addition to this like a standard Wong-Wang model was this extra current that was like flowing into our neuronal population, and that came from all the activity of the external nodes. And that was obviously like modulated by the structural connectivity, but also by a variable. So that would be this our like parameter that we are interested in, which they call the coupling strength G. And then by manipulating coupling strength, they observed that the system like undergoes like 2 bifurcations, as we can see from this like a bifurcation plot that I hopefully already like read how to read. And you can see that there is in particular like 3 different areas of this plot with the single state, where all the nodes send very like a low number of like spikes per second. Then there's like a multi-stability where like each node sort of like switches like a back and forth from this like a high firing rate regime to the low one. And then we have also high firing rate state. But okay, but that was all generated from like this model that we like came up with, and it was like based on this like structural connectivity data. But from this model, what we could also compute is the functional connectivity between these nodes. But also, since we are doing already some like since on the same like participants after apart from structural connectivity recordings, we can also do functional connectivity measures using fMRI. we could compute actually how close our simulated functional connectivity is to the one generated by the model, right? So we compare the functional connectivity from the model with the one that we measured in fMRI. And when we compute such a similarity depending on like a different values of G, so depending on the different values of the coupling strength, we will see that the system, so our model is the closest to the actual data in terms of this like functional connectivity for the value G that is very close to this critical regime. So it's sort of, they refer to it as being on the verge of like criticality. If you want to learn something about why is that and why is this useful, again, I refer you to like this like article, which is quite actually easy to follow, but it also explains that based on information theory, which is mathematical framework that basically describes what are conditions in which information transfer from one point to another is the optimal. And apparently that's the point that gives the best match between the model and the actual data in this case. Okay, I believe that this is pretty much everything that I wanted to cover in my talk. We can wait for some questions, but I believe that we have a little delay here. So yeah, I will pass the mic to Luke. Maybe he would prefer to start already immediately with the exercises.
Perfect, thank you, Dominik. Yeah, so are there any questions for Dominik now before we head on to the exercises? Cool. So I don't think it makes a lot of sense. It's quite a small group now. I don't think it makes a lot of sense for us to go into breakout rooms. So perhaps what we'll do is we'll just all stay in one big room. I'm going to give us 15 minutes or so. In the modeling workshop practical 3 folder, there should be worksheet number 3. So if people want to get started with practical session, with part number 1 in there, we'll give you sort of 15 minutes to run through part 1, and then we'll talk through the solutions. I will just crack on with the answer then. We would expect it to be about 50% of the time, right? Half the time they'll guess left, half the time they'll guess right, because it's completely unbiased. So what we can do is we can check that the coherence is 0%. Can you all see my MATLAB screen?
Yes.
Cool. We can check that the coherence is 0%. We can run the code. You should see that it takes a few seconds to simulate, and it's taking a little while to plot. But you should see something that looks a little bit like this. So what we've got here on the left plot, we've got our 2 populations. Right is red and left is blue. You should see the firing rate of the populations, and in this case blue has won because the threshold is 15 Hertz and the blue population left has gone high. So in this case they guessed left. We can also look at this 2D plot that shows S1, so the synapses for population 1, the right population over here, and S2, the synapses for population 2, the left population over here. And essentially what these green lines show, where the green and the pink line cross are 2 steady states. So this shows at time 0 where we started off. And essentially what this population has done is it started to go towards this saddle steady state that we spoke about earlier. But then it gets repelled in this direction towards this stable steady state over here. And this one corresponds, because the blue is high, you know, blue's around 0.7-ish, and the red is low, it's around 0.1-ish, if that. It means that blue's high, red's low, blue wins. So in fact, what I did is I ran, and there's a code in the solutions folder for you to do this. I ran it 50 times, and this is the result of all 50 simulations. And you can see that around half the time, I think it came out as 28 out of 50 in these 50 trials, they guessed right, and the other times they guessed left, so approximately half. So that matches what we thought using the simulations.
Maybe look, if you also reiterate what those like gray arrows denote on this plot.
Yeah, okay, so the gray arrows just show which way the direction of the flow is. So essentially, if I was to start off over here, I would go straight down towards this saddle steady state. Over here, I would tend towards this one, and basically the flow follows these arrows.
So yeah, as I was saying, this is basically like analogous to those like little arrows that we were drawing like below those like one-dimensional like plots. This time you have like way more degrees of freedom, so you can rotate those like arrows, and also they're like a size towards like 360 degrees. So
again, we showed figure 1 showed the difference when we had coherence at 0%, and you can see it's quite slow to make a decision, and 51%, and it's quite fast to make a decision. There's also, if we look down here at the different coherences, what we expect to see from the data is that as the coherence increases, the number of correct guesses increases. So at 0%, it's around 50%. And also the reaction time decreases, which is what we saw up here. So again, we can run practical 1 a few times. So I can change this to 51.2% and run again. And we see this. So this time it's guessed red this time. Guessed it's going right. So the other thing that we can do though is we can do the multiple simulations. So what I'll show now is I'll bring up the solutions PDF. So that shows this. So this was the 0% coherence figure that I showed you before. 10% coherence here. So you can see there's more red guesses in this one than there is in this one. And again, you can see that most of the guesses go off to the right. Most of them are guessing 10%. Then this is when we had 51.2%, and now all of our guesses have gone to the right here. So it's pretty much entirely correct guesses here. Red high firing rate, blue low firing rate. And what I did at the bottom is I just put each one I had done my 50 trials. So I plotted the percentage that made the correct decision against coherence and also the reaction time. And you see this trend of increasing the coherence, increases number of correct decisions, and increasing the coherence decreases the reaction time. So now is that everything? No, sorry, set the motion coherence to 0% and simulate. Consider the plot of the phase portrait on the right of the generated figure. How many steady states exist, and how many exist when coherence is 0? So again, we can simulate, but I will just bring up the pictures before. So this on the left was the case of 0% coherence, and we had 3 steady states. So the steady states are where the 2 lines cross, remember? So we had 1 stable, 1 saddle, and 1 unstable. And then over here, this is the plot when we've got 100% coherence, and there's only the 1 steady state. Okay, so did we find whether we were ever guaranteed? Well, so can anyone guess, are we ever guaranteed a correct response? How do we interpret that? And how large did the coherence have to be for a correct response? So essentially, we're guaranteed a correct response if there's only 1 steady state. So we saw for 100%, there was 1 steady state. We saw for 51.2, there was still 3. Let's try 65% coherence. And what we can see, there's 1 steady state down there, but then also if we zoom in on this figure, there are 2 more steady states, 1 there and 1 there. Okay, so there's still 3 steady states for 65%. If I take it up to 70, now we've still got this steady state down here because the green and the pink lines cross. But if I zoom in up here, the green and the pink lines no longer cross. So actually you'll find it's from about 69% above coherence. We're always guaranteed to guess the correct answer because that's the only remaining steady state. So let's crack on to part 2 then. I'll give you another sort of 10 minutes or so to run this, and then we'll discuss the solutions again. Hi all, so let's start again then with the next set of solutions, again just in the interest of time. So I'm just going to move this across and we'll go into MATLAB. So the first question asked us to run the script practical 3 part 2 with the stimulus is 30. Now the coherence is automatically set to 0, so we should essentially see that we get the same results as we did in the previous slide. Now, what this black line here shows is the symmetric steady state. Now, I've included a line of code here that ensures that we start on the symmetric steady state, the undecided steady state here. Okay, so no decision has been made at this point. And yet we find that the dynamics always move away from this steady state. So if you had to call the steady state stable or unstable, which of these two would you call it? What does this plot suggest? And actually it suggests that it's unstable because it repels, we move away from the steady state. Now, as Dominik mentioned, there are lots of different types of unstable or not stable, at least, steady states that aren't stable. And so we can look at the eigenvalues to decide what type of steady state it is. And so the console down here prints out the eigenvalues. And here we find that one is negative and one is positive. Now, a stable steady state requires all eigenvalues to be negative. So that validates that this steady state is not stable. Now, what we call it when some eigenvalues are positive and some are negative is we call it a saddle. It attracts in some directions. So our first eigenvector, our first of those sort of blue lines that had the arrows pointing in, is negative, which suggests it's attractive in that direction, but repulsive in the second direction. So that shows that we've got a saddle steady state. So the next question asked us to set the stimulus to 0 and run the script again. So let's see what happens now. Now, does the participant make a decision? We can see that no, actually this time the participant stays approximately at the stable steady state. There's some noise, it's a stochastic differential equation, so it doesn't stay exactly on it, but it floats around the stable steady state without being pushed away to a decision state. So what that says is that the symmetric steady state is likely to be stable. The noise pushes it away, but we get attracted back to it. So again, we can validate this using the eigenvalues, and this time we find that both of the eigenvalues are negative. So it is a stable steady state. So that is question 2. So question 3, we were asked to uncomment all of these lines down here. So you can highlight them, Control and T. And now if I run the script again, we should get a figure 1 that just shows that case, but also a figure 2 here. And this shows the eigenvalues. So we've got 2 eigenvalues because it's a 2-dimensional system. And this shows the eigenvalues as I change the stimulus. So we showed that with 30, we had 1 negative and 1 positive steady state. This dotted black line shows eigenvalues of 0. So this is 1 negative, 1 positive steady state. And we saw with a coherence of 0, there were 2 negative steady states. So it's around 10 that we find that this second eigenvalue, sorry, not steady state, eigenvalues is what I meant earlier, 1 negative, 1 positive eigenvalue. And we find around 10, we have this, this second eigenvalue changes to become positive. So it's at this point here, around 10, that the symmetric steady state should become unstable or become a saddle. And so I asked, do you think a decision will be made for a stimuli of 5, 15, and 25 hertz? So what we can do is, well, we said because at 5, both eigenvalues were negative. 15, one eigenvalue is negative and one eigenvalue is positive. 25, one negative, one positive. Essentially what that means is for 5, it's stable. For the other 2, it's a saddle. So we think that for 5, there should be no decision made, and for 15 and 25, a decision should be made. So let's just see what happens when I run stimulus of 5 Hertz. No decision is made. We stay at this symmetric steady state. 15 Hertz, and we'll run it again. Now you can see we're repelled away from the symmetric steady state, and so we do make a decision. So population 1 was chosen here. And finally, 25 Hertz, and again, this decision was made. So finally, I ask you to fill in the blank. If a steady state changes from unstable to stable, or stable to unstable, as a parameter is varied, a blank has occurred. And the word that I was looking for here was bifurcation. It means a bifurcation has occurred if the steady state has changed from stable to unstable. Great, so now let's start on with number 3, task number 3. This one's quite a, this one's a little bit trickier than the other 2, so I'm going to give you sort of slightly longer to, I'm going to give you only 10 minutes to work on it, but then I'm going to talk for 10 minutes, go a bit more detail about the solutions really for part 3. So it relies quite heavily on these 3 bifurcation diagrams. So notice there is a caption at the very bottom of the page. So I'll leave you to run that. Okay, let's go on to the solutions to this. I understand maybe you didn't have enough time to properly go through it, but yeah, I want to try and get all this sorted so that we can get to the seminar at 4 if we like to. Yeah, so question 1 asks us to consider the bifurcation diagram in figure 4a and to explain from this bifurcation diagram why the stimulus of 30 Hertz always gave rise to a decision. And then it also said, based on the bifurcation diagram, do you think the participant will remember their decision? Do they have working memory of their decision? So, and then finally, we can test our prediction with practical 3, part 3. So let's take a look at the bifurcation diagram in figure 4a. So that's up here. Can I zoom? If I come out of this mode, here we go. Right, so the bifurcation diagram is shown here. So what it shows is mu0 here is the stimulus, okay? And SL is the strength of the left population synapses. So for mu0 is, here red shows a stable steady state, and black shows an unstable or a saddle steady state. So if we look at the point where mu0 equals 30, so around here, we've got a stable steady state for a decision right. Okay, so this means that the left population is very low. A stable symmetric steady state, so the left and right would both have equal values here. And a stable steady state where the left population is high. Sorry, this is unstable, a saddle. This is a stable steady state where the left population is high. So we've made a decision, if we're on this steady state over here, that we're at the left population. The reason we always make a decision is because this is a saddle. Okay, so because it's noisy and the system is noisy, we always get repelled in one of the 2 directions away from the saddle to a steady state. So the next question was, do we think the participant will have working memory of their decision? So you might think, well, how am I supposed to guess this from the bifurcation diagram? But what I'll do is I will bring up a figure that I plotted to try and explain this a little bit more clearly. All of these figures, by the way, that I'm bringing up there can be found in the solutions folder. So here I've got an example where the stimulus is 30, okay, and we've made a decision left. So we're on this branch up here. So we're where this green triangle is. So what we do now, we're asking, if I turn the stimulus off, will I remember my decision? So the stimulus is set back to 0. And so what we do, as soon, because we instantaneously turn this stimulus back to 0, we're not, gradually turning it off, it's turned straight off. So it means that we've jumped from being at this point on this steady state to over at this point here. So same value of SL, but a different value of mu naught. And then when we're over here, we want to move towards the nearest stable steady state. And so what we do there is we just basically follow this green arrow down and we come to this point here. So we don't go all the way down to the symmetric steady state again. So actually, because there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different steady states at the coherence, at stimulus of 0, this allows us to possibly have working memory. And the same could be said if I was on this branch, I'd move across and I'd move to this stable steady state here. So this means that we predict that there should be working memory. We've got this hysteresis, is what we call it, type effect, where we go from here, jump up as the stimulus is introduced, jump up to one of the stable branches, but then as we go back down, we don't go back to the symmetric branch, we go back to this same decision branch. So what happens if I try and simulate the model? We wanted to validate it using practical 3, part 3. So I've got my stimulus of 30. Now on this one, basically, you'll see that the stimulus is only on between times 0 and 2000. So here the stimulus comes on, we make a decision. So the red population is decided here, so it jumps up high. And even after 2000, the red population's firing rate remains much higher than the blue population's firing rate. So the participant has remembered their response, even at 5 seconds, if we were to say, which population did you choose, left or right? Because the left population's firing rate is still high, it means that they remember they've decided left. So then question 2 asked us, was that all of question 1? Sorry, I'm just going to scroll back up to question 2. The bifurcation diagram for NMDA ratio is 0.78. It's shown in figure 4b. So essentially, NMDA ratio is a number that I'm going to times all NMDA synapses by. So if it's less than 1, we're essentially decreasing the strength of NMDA. So we're decreasing it to 78% of its original value here. For this bifurcation diagram, we want to decide whether each of the following statements is true. Does the participant make a decision at, well, the participant will make a decision at 30 Hertz, the participant will make a decision at 90 Hertz stimulus, and finally, if a participant makes a decision, they will have working memory of the decision when the stimulus is removed. And again, we want to test the predictions using the script. So now let's look at 4b. So it looks quite a bit different than 4a. So first of all, let's look at a stimulus of around 30 Hertz, that's about here. So if I apply this decision, apply this stimulus, there's still only one steady state. It's still a symmetric steady state. Neither of the populations is particularly high. So this suggests that no, at 30 Hertz, the participant won't make a decision. At 90 Hertz, so now we're looking around here, now you can see that the symmetric steady state is unstable, and we have a high left decision and a low right decision branch. So now we've got our 2 decision branches over here. So that suggests that part B, will there be a decision for stimulus 90, is true. So part A was false, part B is true. Finally, it said if we remove the stimulus, is there working memory of the decision? So now let's say again, we made our decision left like this, and now we remove the stimulus. We jump back to here. So we stayed high, but we just jump across. Now the question is, do we move to a high branch, or do we move back to the symmetric branch? And here there's only one stable steady state. So we move all the way down here and return back to the symmetric, undecided steady state. So that suggests that if you decrease the NMDA to 78% of its original value, we lose working memory. So let's just try this out in MATLAB. So stimulus 30, NMDA ratio of 0.78. We see no decision is made. So that validates number 1, question A being true. Now let's make it 90 and see if a decision is made. So yep, we see one population is a lot higher than the other population. So it suggests that we have a decision made. It's not quite as strong as before. You know, previously we'd set the decision boundary at around 15 hertz, but one population is higher than the other. Finally, and then we carry on. So finally with C, we said, is there working memory at 90 hertz? And you can see that we return back to this symmetric steady state. So that validates our bifurcation diagram predictions. So finally, what was the third part of this one? So now we want to repeat question 2 for our NMDA ratio of 0.72 using the bifurcation diagram in figure 4C. So if we look at 4C, the bifurcation diagram looks like this. So here there's only ever a symmetric steady state. There's never two branches corresponding to decisions, a left or a right decision. There's only ever, at any value of mu naught, there's only ever one red line. And so what that tells us is that for 30 hertz or 90 hertz or any value of the stimulus, we will never see a decision get made. Which means that C doesn't make sense, because how can they have working memory of a decision without that? And again, if we like, we can validate this. If I go for 0.72 stimulus and 90, no decision is made. The two very similar and have very similar values. So that covers that part. So now just the final section. Question 4, consider a hypothetical disease in which the NMDA synapses are progressively impaired. According to the Wong-Wang model, what is the predicted order of symptoms in the disease progression? So this basically relies on our previous questions. So we saw that for NMDA is equal to 1, we had working memory and we had decision making. We saw that NMDA was 0.78. We saw that it was more difficult to make decisions. We needed a larger stimulus. Okay, so we expect the decision making to be impaired. But also we completely, by that point, had lost our working memory. So we expect working memory to be eventually wiped out and decision making to be impaired. And then at even later stages, NMDA ratio of 0.72, we expect decision making to be completely lost. By that point, all decision making is gone completely. So that's the sort of the predicted order of symptoms: impaired memory, impaired decision making, and lost working memory, and finally completely reduced decision making. So that's everything. Thank you all for attending. Are there any more questions on this before I sign off? Doesn't look like it. Well, if there are any more questions, feel free to email myself or Dominik, and feel free to post on the forum. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you very much again. Bye.